Welcome everyone. Hello, my name is Boa Ganaba. I am the Executive Director of Leading Change Canada. We're so pleased to have you join us for our final session in our series of pre-form workshops in the lead up to Leading Change Capital on Monday. So before we start, I just want to acknowledge that I'm calling in from the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, which is colonially known as Ottawa. I think that we all have a responsibility to respect and affirm the inherent and treaty rights of all Indigenous peoples across this land. So I want to do my part to honor the commitments to self-determination sovereignty Canada has made to Indigenous nations and to Indigenous peoples. We all have that part to play to contribute to the healing and decolonizing journey that we all share together as citizens and immigrants here in Canada. So please feel free to share in the chat your own land acknowledgements from wherever you're joining us from. And Tiernan's going to share a resource that we commonly use to help give some context for those of you who might be new to the purpose of land acknowledgements. So before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items. We're running this session with Zoom meeting, so we encourage you to use the chat, ask questions, interact with other attendees, etc. If you have any tech questions, they can be directed towards Tiernan. And finally, this session is being recorded and will be shared with the rest of the delegation through our private event page. So I don't need to tell any of you that our current political climate is, well, tense, I guess, to put it mildly. But we're coming into an age of recognition that there is value in lifting up voices that have previously not been heard. Inclusivity is one of our core values here at Leading Change, and we want to continuously reflect and work on ensuring that this is a space where people of all identities feel safe to share their stories. So with that, I am so pleased to introduce Tai Jacob, who was previously our education programming coordinator. I'm super excited to learn more about what it means to create brave spaces. So with that, we'll have Tai take it away.
Thank you so much, Bo. So I'm Tai. I use they, them pronouns, and I also want to do a land acknowledgement for where I'm calling in from. So I'm calling in from Toronto or Tikaronto. It's the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And it's now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. And we're also in Dish with One Spoon, Wampum territory, which means that this is an agreement that was made between the First Nations that were here prior to contact, that we would all share the bounty of the land with one spoon, Dish with One Spoon, Wampum. So a little bit more about me. I'm the head of research and project manager at a nonprofit organization called Justice Trans, and we aim to increase access to justice for the trans, two-spirit, and gender nonconforming communities across Canada. And like Bo said, I also used to be the education program coordinator at Leading Change, where I specialized in creating programming related to justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. In general, I am a scholar, a researcher, and a community organizer. I've organized around trans and queer liberation, migrant justice, and climate justice, and I've been a facilitator and moderator of various workshops and panels on these topics. And I developed this framework of brave spaces for leading change while I worked with them this summer. So I'm going to share these tools with you so that you can use them in various meetings, conferences, and workshops. Next slide, please. So just a quick run through of our agenda here today. I'll discuss the frameworks of brave space and civil dialogue, go over what group agreements are and some applications that we can use for them. We'll do a short breakout room activity, so feel free to keep cameras off and muted for now, but when we do that breakout room activity, we'll talk a bit more about how you can be more involved in the space. And there'll be a quick discussion and question period after, and then there'll be some conclusions. Next slide. So what are brave spaces and what is civil dialogue? And I want to talk about this in the context of climate justice. because that is a common theme for everyone here at Leading Change and something that we're all working towards, I think. So this session is grounded in the frameworks of brave space, civil dialogue, and climate justice. Brave spaces are ones where communication across difference is actively engaged in the face of risk, where disagreement has value, and where we commit to sitting with discomfort. Brave spaces allow us to show up fully and also encourage everyone else to show up fully as well. We're allowed to speak our minds in this space, but only in a way that shows respect, care, and love for everyone else in the room. So we show up in a way that recognizes our own humanity and everyone else's as well. Civil dialogue is a framework for approaching conversations where we understand civility not to mean niceness, but rather to mean publicly engaged. So civil dialogue isn't about what is proper or nice. It's about how can we show up as a community and co-create communities together. It's an approach to public engagement with the desire to honor communities, relationships, and the work we need to do together to catalyze transformation that brings about justice, healing, sustainability, and creates a world that we actually want to live in. So civil dialogue is about creating a space where we can talk, where we can be publicly engaged, and where we can begin to build something that can transform our communities towards practices that are rooted in principles of things like climate justice, which is a framework that understands global warming not only as an issue of as a physical issue, but also as a political and an ethical issue. And it's a framework that understands that the people most impacted by global warming are people that are marginalized. So poor communities, Black and Brown communities, migrant communities, etc. And that often the drivers of climate change are the people that are going to be the least impacted by it. So brave space and civil dialogue are great frameworks for engaging in some of the controversial topics that might come up when we're talking about climate justice. So how can we create brave spaces? Next slide, please. A great way to create brave spaces is through something called group agreements, which are just the foundation of a conversation. They provide a relational and ethical framework for us to talk to one another, and they allow us to answer questions like, how will we engage each other? How can we create a space together where we feel valued, heard, challenged, and transformed? And these agreements then can guide our conversations and can guide how we answer some of these questions. I want to note that group agreements are not rules. They're different than rules. They are collectively created and agreed on and only can work through a flat power dynamic rather than a hierarchical one, which is a power dynamic that rules often function through. So there are agreements that are created by parties that understand that we're coming into the space on as much of a level playing field as we can. Of course, there are ways that power dynamics show up in spaces through various social locations and positionalities. But as we're creating group agreements, we're really trying to create this flat power dynamic. Brave space and civil dialogue frameworks call us to make group agreements explicit. We name them and create them in order to create a space that can be transformative, productive, and challenging. And we create group agreements so that the groups that we're in can function as microcosms for the world we actually want to live in. If we can create a space here where we feel valued, seen, challenged, and transformed, then we also have hope for creating communities and cultures that can do that as well. So in that way, this is an emergent process. And this is a process that is like Adrienne Mary Brown's concept of fractals, where if we start at a small level of creating the cultures and communities that we want, that can actually fractal outwards to create larger communities that look like that as well. Next slide, please. So some group agreement examples. This example is from a space called Breathing Room. It's a group called the #LetUsBreathe Collective, which is an alliance of artists and activists organizing through a creative lens to imagine a world without prisons and police. The collective operates this space called the Breathing Room Space, which is a Black-led liberation headquarters for arts, organizing, and healing in Chicago's South Side. So you can see here that some of their brave space agreements are, they say, by entering into this space, I agree to love myself and others. I agree to be accountable for what I do and say. I agree to struggle against racism, sexism, ageism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, classism, misogyny, shame, and other harmful systems. I agree to handle conflict with love, respect, and without calling the police. I agree that my gifts bring value to the space, and I receive the gifts that this space offers me. Um, and and the Let Us Breathe Collective understands these brave space agreements as bringing the practice of abolition into an everyday praxis. So the abolition movement comes from the movement to abolish slavery in the States. And today it refers to a wider movement that wants to abolish the prison industrial complex and recreate how our communities respond to harm. So rather than responding to harm with punishment, violence, and cages or prisons, abolition seeks to create a different world, similar to the way that a different world was created when slavery was abolished. And for a space like Breathing Room, brave spaces allow us to bring abolition into everyday practice because they allow us to reimagine how to handle conflict without punishment, without the punishment of oppressive systems like prisons and the police system. So for example, one of these agreements is that they agree to handle conflict without calling the police. And so this allows us, these principles allow us to work through difference as a group and as a community. And I think for a space like Breathing Room, this example of, for example, like not agreeing to handle conflict without calling the police is especially, it has particular valences as a community in Chicago South Side, which has a long history of racist policing practices. So I think that's a great principle in general, to handle conflict without calling the police, but it has particular valences for this group too, as one that's operating in Chicago South Side. Next slide. So Breathing Room gave us one very specific example of how we could use brave space agreements or group agreements, but there are many other ways that we can use them. So we can use them at conferences like Leading Change. We can use them at community organizing meetings, in workshops where we might be talking about difficult topics. They work best in groups of 5 to 20 people. And the reason for that is that we do really want to feel like they're co-created. So they work best when everyone in a group feels like they can be heard. Honestly, 20 people is kind of pushing it. The less people, the better. But of course, some groups will be bigger, and they do still work in larger groups. But it always works best with fewer people, where people really feel like they can co-create those agreements together and be heard in that process. In general, they're useful in any situation where you're bringing together people with different identities and experiences, and or having difficult, controversial, or challenging conversations. They can be used as a one-off. So let's say you're meeting with this group only one time. They're definitely suitable in that situation, but they're also really good in ongoing situations. So groups that meet on a regular basis, like that example of the Breathing Room in Chicago South Side, and they can be revisited at the start of each meeting, so that they can be co-created again as dynamics change. As I said before, these are emergent processes. So I have been facilitating for a while, and in my time as a facilitator, I've met quite a few other facilitators. And there was one facilitator who I met, who disagreed with me about the importance of group agreements. For him, he didn't think they made a difference. He said that in the groups that he was facilitating, whether or not they made group agreements didn't make a change to how the group functioned, in his experience. And I mean, I obviously disagreed with them. I'm doing this workshop, and I've worked on this framework, but I think that there's a few reasons why that might be the case, and I think there's a few arguments for why group agreements are actually really helpful and important. So why they might not have made a difference is, I think it's really important to introduce group agreements within this praxis and this framework of brave space and civil dialogue. So if people are entering into the exercise of creating group agreements with the understanding that they get to actively co-create the space and co-create how we interact with each other, then I think that makes this concept a lot more powerful. And also, even if this facilitator didn't feel like they made a huge difference, I think there's something very, very powerful to be said about everyone in a group feeling like they get to co-create that space. that they get to co-create how we will engage with each other. I think that's really, really important when we're having difficult or controversial conversations about things like climate justice, about things like energy mix or circular economy, or any number of things that might come up at a forum like Leading Change Capital. So I think they're very useful, despite what other people might think. I think that there is, I disagree with that facilitator, and I think that they're very powerful. And in order to really give them their full power, it's important to acknowledge how important it is to invite people to co-create a space together, rather than allowing group agreements to be tacit and not mentioned. Because when that's the case, we don't get to invite in care and respect and love into a space in a way that can be very powerful and allow us to be challenged and transformed through the ways that we engage with each other. Next slide, please. So at Leading Change, we have a list of 11 agreements that I created with the steering committee over the summer while I worked with Leading Change. And I'll lay them out now for you. They're on the slide, and I'll describe them in a bit more detail. It's great to pay attention to, try and keep in mind the group agreements that are on this slide and the ones that were on the slide about the breathing room, brave space agreements, because you'll be creating your own group agreements. So make a note of ones that you like, and you can use them later. Okay, so with that being said, here are some of the group agreements at Leading Change Canada. And that's awesome, Brianna. Thank you for dropping those in the chat. So accountability and responsibility. This agreement is about taking responsibility for your actions and your social location or positionality, and committing to dismantle systems of oppression. Agency is about recognizing the power we have to make the choices that align with the changes we wish to see in the world. So recognizing that we have power to make change. The Chatham House rule is just the simple rule of what's said here stays here, what's learned here leaves here. So allowing for anonymity of people's particular experiences, but still taking the lessons away from the space. Collective care is about a commitment to working with the group to build a space where everyone can feel cared for and heard. Diversity is about valuing and encouraging contributions from people whose background, identity, or experiences, or even political lens might be different from your own. Fun is just what it sounds like, a commitment to encouraging for fun and joyous moments as we're having these conversations. Gratitude, being grateful for whatever the space has to offer you, and also for the gifts that you yourself bring to the space. Humility is operating with a growth mindset when we make mistakes. Integrity is about acting in a way that's aligned with your principles, and is full of love and respect for everyone in the group. Inclusivity is about looking out for others and actively questioning who may not be in the room or feel comfortable to contribute. And relationships are about prioritizing the relational aspect of a conversation. So listening actively and generously, and coming with a desire to connect and build community. Cool. So next slide. Now we're going to go into a breakout room activity so that you can take the frameworks that I've shared with you today and the new knowledge that you have about group agreements to create your own group agreements. So there are, I think there will be enough space for 2 breakout rooms, which will be great. In your breakout room, you're going to spend about 5 or so minutes doing a round of check-ins. I'm also going to drop this in the chat so that it can stick with you. Oh, Bo, you got it. Okay. Yeah, so do a round of check-ins, share your name and your pronouns if you wish. And then as a check-in, you can describe your mood as if you were describing the weather. So for example, my mood today is, it's a very, very humid summer day, and it's just threatening to rain, but it hasn't yet. So you can describe your mood like that. And then you're going to spend the second half creating a list of around 5 group agreements. It's okay if there's a little bit less. It's okay if there's a little bit more. And you can build them from the Leading Change's existing list, or incorporate your own ideas, or a mix of both. And create them as if you're about to have a conversation with your group about climate justice more generally. Yeah, so both of you chose to put down humility, both of you chose to put down fun. And even if the other like words that you decided on weren't the same, I think the sentiment was very similar. I'm wondering, how did the exercise feel to do? Like, how did it feel to co-create that space?
I can go. I think it was actually quite amazing because I think when we come into a group, one of the things that we discussed was leaving your ego or judgment at the door, and that's something that really resonated with me. Coming to a group or talking about something which is as humongous as climate justice, just being able to have these group agreements, and when you know that all of us agree to it, or at least we're all coming to the table with the same group agreements, it makes me more comfortable in that setting. And I think that's very important for when we're discussing something as big as climate justice, or any climate change issue.
Just reading, I'm going to read out what Brianna put in the chat. The process of chatting through was even more helpful than the words themselves. I think that really gets to that co-creative aspect of the process, where it's not about like the actual words, it's about the space that you create by saying those words. So I really like that. And the kickoff icebreaker, we were all feeling a bit foggy, so it was nice to relate to one another on that common space. It was a great way to introduce and connect. Random fact about me is I love talking about the weather. I know people think it's boring, but I think it's endlessly interesting. So I love the idea of like describing your mood as the weather. Anyways, not super relevant to group agreements. Did people feel like they would have felt more comfortable approaching the topic of climate justice after having created these agreements?
Yeah, if I could just step in for a second. It felt like we could discuss kind of anything, and everything subjective was secondary. So we addressed kind of this, we all kind of agreed that we shared these values. And then at that point, we can just talk about whatever. So it was great. Yeah.
Yeah, a great way to find common ground. Any other comments, questions, thoughts on the process?
Yeah, I think one really interesting aspect of this exercise is that it helps you reflect on like what you yourself find valuable in having these kind of conversations, right? It's like sometimes it's very easy to go into these kind of spaces and um, not have an idea about why you're entering into the space, or like what you really hope to get out of it, or how you want to relate to the other people in there. Is it only about you getting your opinion out there, or are you really there to learn? Are you really there to create the space where we can learn from each other? Those kind of things. So being able to take some time and reflect on what you really value about these conversations in these spaces, I think is super helpful.
Amazing. Anybody else? Any questions about the process or how it could be used?
I maybe have a comment on that. It was something that Aaliyah talked about in our conversation, and was reflecting about, because in a way this is kind of like a non-corporate version of a terms of reference. It's like, how are we going to operate this way? And she kind of commented around like how currently, like, you go into this room, you have 30 minutes to make a big decision, and then some ideas get put on the board, and those are the ones that you just end up like running with. And I think that this kind of set the space to be a different way to approach those problems, and like approach those conversations. And it kind of felt like a way to reset it. And it's something that I think going forward, I'd really like to do in meetings like that and groups like that, is to use those spaces or create those spaces before just powering forward, because you're probably not coming up with the best solution potentially. So
Yeah, I like how the process invites you to slow down. Because if we take the time to create a space where we can have a conversation, then we're also going to take the time to make sure we're actually listening to everyone. And often in board meetings, like 2 to 3 people will dominate the conversation. But the great thing about setting out these agreements beforehand is like you really try to prevent that from happening. Awesome. Any final thoughts before Bo closes us out?
I was just gonna say, I like, at least with our group, the very first word we came up with was fun. So it really set the tone for our conversation to kind of discuss more and be free to go off topic, but that ended up coming back in topic. And it's just nice because we're all coming from common grounds of being youth who are passionate about climate change. So it was nice to have the fun with the actual work.
I'm so glad that it was fun. Thank you all so much for showing up, listening, learning, speaking with each other. It's been such a pleasure to facilitate this.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. And thank you, Tai. That was wonderful. I feel so light now after that conversation and that exercise. So it sets me off to have a wonderful rest of my day. So I hope it does the same for all of you. So before we go, just a couple of reminders. Just one, that the Visible site is live, and if you haven't had a chance to explore the site and see the agenda, definitely recommend that you do so, especially over this weekend, so that you're prepared for Monday. And if you haven't already done so, also make sure to join the private LinkedIn group for the 2021 Capital Delegation. This is a great way to start meeting other delegates and to stay up to speed with important event reminders. And then finally, if you're on any social channels, we encourage you to follow and interact with us at Leading Change and use that hashtag, hashtag LC2021, to share your experience. So thank you all once again for joining us. And that'll be it. We'll see you all on Monday. And yeah, hope you're all excited because we definitely are.